Hello everyone, my name is Pradeep Balaji and I'm part of the library team at IHS. IHS Library is a public reference library. As part of the library efforts, we curate um, quarterly library exhibitions. So I'm happy to introduce Subhay Babarwal, who joins me, curated this 30th library exhibition titled Public Spaces, to talk about the process and the work that went behind curating this collection. Welcome, Subhay.
Thanks, Pradeep. I'm Subhay, and I'm an architect. And here at IHS, I'm an external consultant with the academics office. And I was very glad when Pradeep sort of, invited me to curate an exhibit for the public library. And when we came about it, it came through this abstract poetry that began with we broke into mosaic tiles, deeply embedded by our diverse roots. Plazas and markets where our public thrives, uninhibited by this population disputes. And that sort of triggers many ideas of how a public space must encourage people to sort of own the streets. It's where the culture lives and where a city comes alive. I had this question in my mind that our cities are constantly transposing to accommodate this mega paradigm shift that we're experiencing. Unlike other European cities, our cities in India, the contemporary cities, are expanding. But what's happening at the same time is that our public spaces are diminished in some way. In a space where we need to flourish, the inhabitants are facing a sort of barrier. Now you have, if you take public parks, you have certain time. You're restricted by time. And if you have plazas, you're restricted by activity. So who is really allowed to own the space? And why is that our public spaces have these, barriers that sort of break down in a way?
Totally. There are many things to think about in terms of accessibility, um, um, design, keeping the gender aspects in mind, and so on.
I think it's not just gender. Inclusivity has to be beyond just gender, right? It has to be about who can access it, from which backgrounds. Is it, because let's say if there's a neighborhood, right? People living in that affluent neighborhood are able to access these public spaces. But what happens with spaces of marginalized societies, Do they have the public space? Do they have the same kind of infrastructure that allows them to thrive? To sort of celebrate their culture, because your built environment at the end of the day reflects on the cultures you sort of exhibit. So so I feel like barrier is not just physical, but it's also who is able to access it and from where, and if there are enough infrastructure or spaces that allow people to thrive. And that itself is like a very unsettling question, when you think about it. I want people to wander cities and experience and start like looking into what does it really mean, like even public art for that example. If you look, there are only few spaces in the city where public art is displayed. Why isn't it other places as well? If you take examples from our ancient medieval cities where public plazas were everything happened there, even our temples for that example, right? People didn't go to worship before, they went to gain knowledge, to share art and culture and celebrate it, which isn't happening in today's contemporary times. So that's the shift I'm talking about, that major shift that comes into place. Public spaces are beyond spatial configurations, right? So we look at transient environments. You have your bus stops, your metro stations. You have so many different spaces that are public but don't occur as public spaces at first glances, and also how people are restricted to use these spaces, right? Because they obviously encompass a large chunk of public space. We don't realize that, but it's a large chunk of it. But also, like, who ends up using that space and what do they experience in these spaces? For that example, I think Cubbon Park is very interesting because the Cubbon Park metro station allows people to showcase art and trigger dialogues and conversations that changes the way people sort of behave in that public realm, right? And that is the point. And then we went through various ideas also looking at homelessness. We have people who camp in public space. We have people who live through it. who have their entire lives going by it, right? But we also have these different niches of various ideas of, let's say, security, or even what does a safe public space feel like. So there's so many diverse aspects that we did encompass. I think what's good about this exhibit is it brings in multiple perspectives and it adds layers, because suddenly you have art, but you also have surveillance, you have, you know, homelessness, but you have inclusivity, you have this and that, and it segues into various aspects. But again, comes down to what it means to celebrate cultures in public spaces. Yeah, and this exhibit confronts that in various tiers, I feel.
The multiple layers that you brought out. The two books that good to highlight here is the Carbon Park by Rupa Pai and the Lal Bagh by Suresh Jayaraman. The wonderful two books on Bangalore, on the public spaces. Yeah, and so as we speak about public spaces and their importance, can you tell, you know, organizing this exhibition, what do you think we could achieve, and where it will help us to have conversations around?
I think what's also important right now is for us to include diverse people. As we mentioned, the book's very inclusive. So we need to like have conversations with with stakeholders. You have the publics, you have the artists, you have young designers who are negotiating with the government to revive public spaces, right? That did exist in our cities, but they want to revive it in a way that sort of integrates into the present contemporary scenarios and planning. And it's very interesting if you could have all of them in one table to really discuss how to move forward, and also the public involved, wherein we hear voices. That would help. That would sort of help trigger these conversations and maybe at some point ripple down into effective change.
Why would you recommend people to visit this exhibition?
I think what this exhibition does at its most focal point is it opens out the way people think about public spaces. Because as we said, as I said earlier, people think public space to be spatial. But what happens if we don't have a permanent space, right? Like let's say Rahul Malhotra's book on Kumbh Mela, it talks about how public spaces can exist, a city itself can exist for a couple of weeks in the lap of the Ganges River and then not be there at all. And that itself talks differently of how public spaces can also be temporary, right? Like we have parks and we have that, but what about, you know, carnivals and festivals? Our streets become public spaces, right? And then this idea about this other book that talks about surveillance, privacy, and public spaces, which is a very fantastic book because it again goes into another layer of how streets are surveyed, how it's not just the government or the cameras, but also people. You know, our streets are filled with people, and we're celebrating each one through different lenses. And that's when, what another book that I liked is when John Gall talks about cities for people. So we have books that includes various layers of it, and they sort of ripple onto each other, right? And then we sort of start questioning with this other book by Ranjit Sabik about sense of space, and we sort of look into the sensibilities of what these spaces look like. Your footpath itself is a public space. How do you own it? There are some movements across the globe where people take the circumference, I mean the perimeter of a car, the space that it takes for parking, and what can you do in that space. And people like put like couches and furniture and this and that. So my point is that there are various ways to use a public space, and this exhibit allows people to think of various tiers that we don't see otherwise. And also, I think it will make people sensitive to observe, own, and bring in new narratives. As our cities are transposing and there's a shift, I think our public spaces will begin to have new typologies into place. So I welcome everyone to come and see our exhibit, and thank you.